Okay. Well done, everybody, making it this far through the day. I hope you've had some coffee. I'm a philosopher, theologian, and I'm going to get into it now. We're going to really get thinking about some reasons and some evidence. Not everybody who has, not every reason that we're going to talk about, not every different clue that we're going to discuss is going to be helpful for all of us. But I think even if that particular clue doesn't appeal to us, it's still helpful to know about it, isn't it? How many of you have conversations with people around you about faith, and you come to the conversation of, well, how do you know God's real? How do you know God's there? And you'd like more to say. You'd like more to say at that point. My hope is that I'm going to equip you a bit. Charlie and I will equip you today to do a bit of that. So let me introduce myself first, and then we'll get into it. My name's Tom Price. I'm one of the tutors and lecturers at OCCA, this Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, where we love equipping believers and also giving a hope to people exploring and thinking about faith, giving an answer to their question and helping them on their journey. My journey to faith was helped by asking questions. I was an undergraduate doing a computer science and philosophy degree at the University of Reading. And as I was sitting there in an AI lecture, so listening and learning about artificial intelligence, as I sat there in the lecture, the question that came to me was, are we ever going to really be able to make a machine think like a human being can? Now, I know I don't look it, but this was 25 years ago. And I went to the lecturer at the end of the lecture and said, do you think we're ever going to be able to do this? And I'd waited till nobody else was around at that point, because I thought my question might be a bit silly for an academic. I wasn't very confident, left school at 15, had only just got back into education and uni when I was in my sort of early 20s. And he said, it all depends. It all depends whether you think a human being is just a complicated, biological, mechanical thing, or whether you think there's a soul or a spark as well as that biological part. I said, that sounds like a philosophical question about, what a human being really is, what actually reality is. He said, yeah, it is. It's philosophy. And I was very glad at that point my uncle had persuaded me to add philosophy to my degree, because that's where I went. That then led to me, I'll tell you the rest of the story at the end of my talk. So is there any evidence for Christianity? I mean, sometimes we think this is a little bit of a kind of a strange thing to say and talk about, because isn't faith something we have without evidence? Isn't the whole point of faith believing and trusting God, and not necessarily something we can see or something we can have data for? How is it right that we should ask for evidence or data? Surely that's doubting God in some way that's not right. I don't agree with that. I think actually if you look at the Old Testament, where the prophets say to the people of God, come back to God, they point to God's great acts in redemptive history as justification for them saying, listen to God now. He's good God. He rescued you out of exile. He's the one who brought you out of Egypt. He's the one who's provided for you in the desert. Remember what he has done. Remember these events. And then in the New Testament, where we have the proclamation of the gospel, actually, that's on the basis of what the witnesses to the rising of Christ have seen and heard. So actually, faith is something that is bound up with and tied to events and reasons and evidence. Something that's not far away from reasons and evidence, actually from its earliest times in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Faith is about making sense of something that you think is true. Faith is about being persuaded that what you believe is true is really real and true. Which is why the New Testament uses, when it speaks positively of faith, it's rooted in a Greek verb or word form called pisteo or pistis, which means, so when you read in your Bible, have faith in Jesus, or put your faith in God, or have faith that what God is doing is real, that's translated from the original Greek. And the original Greek word that's often used there is the word pisteo or pistis. And that word means to be persuaded that what you believe is real and true. So even in the Greek, actually it's about reason and evidence and a relationship to reason and evidence. But is Christianity even meant to make sense? Well, that's a good question. I think it is, because I think God made us with minds, that we could worship him with our minds, and that we could come to him in full trust. I've got 3 kids. I've got a 14-year-old, 12-year-old, and a 9-year-old. I want them to love me and to have a good relationship with me, and I want them to trust me. And I think part of that is they get to see the evidence of what I'm like. Do I provide a safe place for them? Am I encouraging towards them? Do I look after them? Am I attentive to them? And I think God, as your Heavenly Father and my Heavenly Father, wants us to be confident of the relationship we have with him. He doesn't want us to be constantly saying, oh, this might not be true, this might not be real. No, he wants to give us enough information, enough data that we can be deeply confident in worship of him and knowing him and having a relationship with him. Okay? I want to play you a clip now, which I think hopefully sets the scene for how I approach evidence and reasons for faith. This is a scene from Sherlock. Any Sherlock fans? I'm sure there are 1 or 2 hiding. We love detective fiction, don't we? Detective fiction is one of the most popular types of story, types of Netflix drama or Amazon Prime drama that we can watch. If you think of Morse, Endeavour, you think of Luther, the great detective stories of Bosch, or of the sort of the scientific ones of CSI, Sherlock Holmes, obviously famously from London, from Baker Street. My daughter and I went to visit the supposed house. I know it's a fictitious story, but a lot of people actually believe it's real. Anyway, this is the story. This is a little moment where Sherlock uses what's called abductive reasoning. So we can do scientific reasoning where we can repeat something, where we infer, or we make kind of reasoning from evidence, and we can repeat an experiment. That's usually called deductive or inductive reasoning, scientific types of reasoning. But when a detective or a forensic police scientist comes across a crime scene, they have to use something called abductive reasoning. And this is where you reason from sort of semi-clear premises, semi-clear ideas to probable conclusions. And that's often what we're doing in life. It's what you do when you buy something from eBay. It's what you do when you buy a phone from a shop. It's what you do when you think about trusting yourself to a job or a career or an environment or an organization. You don't have all the information about them. You have some information, and you make a likely conclusion out of that observation. That's exactly what the detective does. Here's a moment where we can just marvel at how brilliant Sherlock does this.
Okay, you've got questions.
Yeah, where are we going?
Crime scene, next.
Who are you? What do you do?
What do you think?
I'd say private detective,
But
but the police don't go to private detectives.
I'm a consulting detective. The only one in the world that invented the job.
What does that mean?
It means when the police are out of their depth, which is always, they consult me.
The police
not
don't
a
consult
humble man.
amateurs.
When I met you for the first time yesterday, I said Afghanistan or Iraq. You looked surprised.
Yes, how did you know?
I didn't know, I saw. Your haircut, the way you hold yourself says military. But your conversation as you entered the room
A bit different from my day.
said trained at Bart, so army doctor, obvious. Your face is tanned. But no tan above the wrists. You've been abroad, but not sunbathing. Your lips really bad when you walk, but you don't ask for a chair when you stand, like you've forgotten about it. So it's at least partly psychosomatic. That says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatic. Wounded in action, then. Wounded in action, suntan, Afghanistan, or Iraq.
You said I had a therapist.
Got a psychosomatic limp, of course you've got a therapist. Then there's your brother. Your phone, it's expensive, email-enabled MP3 player. Are you looking for a flat share? You wouldn't waste money on this. It's a gift, then. Scratch is not one. Many over time. It's been in the same pocket as keys and coins. Man sitting next to me wouldn't treat as one luxury item like this. So it's had a previous owner. Next bit's easy, you know it already.
The engraving.
Harry Watson, clearly a family member who's given you his old phone. Not your father, this is a young man's gadget. Could be a cousin, but you're a war hero who can't find a place to live. Unlikely you've got an extended family, certainly not one you're close to, so brother it is. Now Clara, who's Clara? 3 kisses says there's a romantic attachment. Expense of the phone says wife, not girlfriend.
She must have given it to him recently. This model's only 6 months old. Marriage in trouble then. 6 months on, he's just given it away. If she'd left him, he would have kept it. People do sentiment, but no, he wanted rid of it. He left her. He gave the phone to you. That says he wants you to stay in touch. You're looking for cheap accommodation, and you're not going to your brother for help. It says you've got problems with him. Maybe you liked his wife. Maybe you don't like his drinking.
How can you possibly know about the drinking?
Shot in the dark. Good one, though. Power connection, tiny little scuff marks around the edge of it. Every night he goes to plug it in to charge, but his hands are shaking.
You never see those marks on a sober man's phone, never see a drunk's without them. There you go, see, you were right.
I was right. Right about what?
The police don't consult amateurs.
That was amazing.
There we are. And it's amazing, isn't it, how the little steps of logic work, and they come from observations, don't they? Are you still on mute? Oh, sorry.
Still on mute, less on mute now. It's amazing how the little steps of logic work. They're from little observations, and then they're put together, and that forms a kind of picture, doesn't it, like a tapestry, where you don't see the whole thing until you step back. Well, I think we need to think in terms of clues. I think we need to step back and look at the evidence and look at the clues. So here is, there are all sorts of clues we could look at. I think there are 30, 40, 50 different types of clues. You've got an amazing booklet that goes along with this series, I think called 12 Reasons, 12 Evidences for Faith. I read through that and I thought it was really helpful, some really good reasons. I'd like to add on top of that these 6 reasons or clues. So here they are. I'll go through these, and this is the structure of what we'll talk about over the next half an hour or so. So the first clue is called cosmic fine-tuning. I'll explain that. The next clue is right and wrong, and specifically a type of way of understanding where right and wrong comes from and where it is grounded, so where its foundation rests. Thirdly, the way that human imagination functions, particularly around the nature of story and the searching for a hero through the use of imagination. Fourth clue, what C.S. Lewis called the unmet desire or the unsatisfied longing that we have. Fifth clue, Jesus' life and his resurrection, his identity, the works of his life, his miracles, his interactions with people, his insights, his fulfillment of prophecy. And then sixthly, he changed me, personal testimony, my story, your story, and how we share that and fold that into the way we offer a picture of somebody, a picture of the world that somebody could believe in. And at the center, I think these all point into, some of them get us further towards just belief in God. Others take us a little bit further and more directly into the type of God that might be there. So, for example, I think thinking about Jesus and maybe thinking about the desire argument that we have, the desire, the unmet desire, they take us a little closer into a loving God, a God who's revealing himself as merciful, holy, just, and loving. On the other hand, I think that cosmic fine-tuning and the argument from right and wrong, they lead us a little bit of the way, but they don't take us all the way to describing what God is like. They kind of create a sympathetic framework, if you like. So what do we mean by cosmic fine-tuning? Sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? And it's this. It's that the finely tuned laws of the universe are best explained through the idea of a powerful and intelligent creator. I've got a little video to show you in a second to explain what I mean like this. So whether you believe, however you believe the universe came about, whether you believe there was a big bang and those initial conditions and then a rapid expansion, or whether it was created as is, however you believe, whatever your view is, the universe seems like it's finely tuned for life. It seems like there are certain sets of laws and constants which, if they weren't the case, the universe either wouldn't exist or wouldn't be life permitting. So these are observations that come from scientific study of the universe. This is not a gap in our understanding, and then we go, okay, maybe God can fit into the gap in our understanding, what we might call God of the gaps arguments. It's not that. This is a bit of information, a bit of study about the universe, astrophysics, has opened up these insights about how finely tuned the physical laws are. And then we're saying, what do we do with that data? Like Sherlock, what do I do with that observation? Where do I go? What's the best explanation for that situation? Liken it to winning the lottery. Imagine you see somebody and they win the lottery over and over and over again. Do you know the chances of winning the lottery? You've got a better chance of, the chances of getting struck by lightning, you've got 1 in 1 million chance of getting struck by lightning in your lifetime. You actually got a chance of being killed by a vending machine, it might encourage you to know. You've got 1 in 112 million chance of being killed by a vending machine. Maybe it has to fall on you or something. Maybe you're left-handed. There is the chance, if you're left-handed, of using a right-handed product incorrectly and of that killing you. 1 in 4.4 million. Slightly better chances. You have a chance 1 in 1. Is that 1 billion? I think that's 1 billion of becoming a movie star. Chance of being an astronaut, 1 in 12 million, becoming a professional athlete, 1 in 22,000. But imagine somebody wins the lottery, and you see somebody that you know, and they win the lottery 42 times in a row. What do you say if you see that? Time machine, so some kind of knowledge they must have. Because you can't just explain it by luck. That number of very improbable events occurring in a sequence together adds complication to the probability, doesn't it? It makes it so unlikely that the reasonable person has to say there's something else going on. Time machine, cheating, something else. It's a bit like you're playing a game of cards. Of course, none of you play cards, but imagine you were playing a game of cards and you see somebody playing a game of poker and they play a royal flush and they play 42 royal flushes in a row. The reasonable person, the rational person, the person who's evidence-based, who's a thinking person, the logical person says there's something else going on here. The unreasonable person, the irrational person might say, no, it's just natural processes, natural probabilities. I mean, yes, there's a very slim chance of that, but actually, it's much more reasonable to say something else is going on. Watch this video, and it's going to give you an idea of how this is going on. This is the situation that we're actually in the cosmos and the universe that we're in.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, Our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he is hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely.
Isn't that interesting? Now, I don't know about you. I've been spending a little bit of time on the river recently. I've got a kayak. I quite enjoy exploring different waterways in Oxford. And if I see a duck, I tend to think, okay, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, swims like a duck, then there's a good chance it might taste like a duck too. It's a basic principle of knowledge that the philosopher Richard Swinburne calls the principle of credulity. That we ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. And therefore, everybody agrees, the agnostic Professor Paul Davies says, everyone agrees that the universe looks as if it is designed for life. That's what it seems to be the case, doesn't it, scientifically? That's what we've just seen. So let's lay out the argument like this. Let's lay out the reasons. We ought to believe that things are as they seem to be until we have evidence that we're mistaken. The fine-tuning of the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, seems like it is designed. Conclusion, therefore, in the absence of sufficient counter-evidence or explanations, we should believe that the fine-tuning is designed. Does that make sense? It's quite exciting and interesting, isn't it? Science there opening, not an area of conflict with religious belief or Christian belief, but science there opening up an area of dialogue, opportunity, conversation, perhaps evidence and evidential support pointing towards belief in God, pointing towards Christian faith. Okay, so that's the first of our 6 reasons. That is cosmic fine-tuning. Just think to yourself, I wonder how I'd put that in my own words if I just had a couple of minutes to talk about that with somebody. Just think about that as you just reflect on that. Okay, the next clue or sign is right and wrong. And I'm going to describe this as true for everybody moral values. Now, I know that in different cultures, in different parts of the world, there are slightly different practices that we have culturally. But generally speaking, across the world, human beings agree that peace and kindness and love are preferable to violence, to imprisonment without cause, to oppression. We agree that protecting innocent life is right and praiseworthy, and that harming innocent life without any cause is not okay and is morally wrong. There's actually a huge amount of agreement globally about right and wrong. There might be a different amount that's paid for a bride in a different country, or that something we do differently when we enter a home culturally, but I always love visiting people from Germanic and Austrian countries in particular, because they always have this amazing collection of flip-flops and slippers that you can put on when you go into their home. It's lovely. I wish we did that a little bit more here. I just make people take their shoes off and say, if you're going to walk on the carpet. Anyway, but we do have different things we do, but actually there's a huge amount in common, isn't there, that we have. When we
live out the true meaning of its creed, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream.
Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech appealed to principles and a value that every human being has. When, whatever your politics, when Barack Obama was voted President of the United States, compared to the oppression that black people experienced in America, in the American South, that growth, and there's a long way to go in America still, I think, but that growth and progress that they had made was celebrated around the globe. That actually, we all thought, that's amazing, that is real growth, that's real development. A society, a culture has grown in morally, in stature there. There's been cultural progress too in areas like women's rights and in protection of children. We have seen moral progress in a number of different areas in our world. Workers' rights is another example. When we make judgments across cultures and we say what they're doing in that country is wrong, what we're doing here is right, or they shouldn't be doing that. Like, for example, happened in the Nuremberg war trials after the Second World War, where the Nazis said, no, what we were doing was absolutely fine. We are the legally representative government voted by the majority of the people. We passed laws that gave us permission to do what we're doing. You have no right to judge us. That was their defense in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Imperial War Trial Tribunal said that's actually not the case, because this tribunal rules on principles of morality which go across all cultures and creeds, across all peoples. Those are the principles we use to make a judgment. And so they were, again, appealing to these shared values. And so the idea that a culture can grow in moral condition, from this position to this position, getting sort of better, improving things. And the idea of these shared values which can be used to judge cultures where there's inappropriate and evil behavior. That idea suggests that there are true for everybody, true for everyone, moral principles or moral values. And this clue starts from that point. It starts from the idea that there are true for everyone moral values of some kind, even though there are some differences. And it asks, what is the best explanation for these true for everyone values, for right and wrong, that actually, where do they sit? Where do they rest? What is their foundation? Because if we say that the universe is just cold, dark, empty space, aren't moral values then a little bit like a sandcastle that you build on the beach below the tide line? Doesn't that cold, dark, massive, empty space in some way undermine the stability and the credibility of those moral principles? The evolutionary scientist Richard Dawkins was asked, could we have evolved differently? Could we have evolved in a different way so that, for example, rape would be something that was morally praiseworthy? So Justin Brierley, a journalist, said to him, okay, ultimately your belief that rape is wrong is just arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. And Richard Dawkins concedes, yes, you could say that, yes. I think that theism, that the belief in God, is better at this point because it doesn't collapse moral values. Thank you, Charlie. It doesn't collapse moral values. It doesn't undermine it like the sea coming into the sandcastle on the beach. It takes these shared values and it actually acknowledges that they are deeply meaningful and part of the fabric of the world. And so I think it's more satisfying to say that there's a God who sees, who supplies, and who grounds moral values and moral principles. Second reason is this. I'm giving you 2 reasons inside this clue. The second reason is this. So we have these shared values. One way that moral philosophers, who spend a lot of time thinking about how moral reasoning works and how obligations work, which is another way of talking about how when you make a judgment about right and wrong, it creates obligations or principles, or it's what we call normative. It creates expectations for other people to do things. One thing that they're thinking about is maybe relationships, maybe in some way depth of relationship is related to the strength of obligation. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You can see where they're going. It's some way related to the social contract, to the way we relate to each other. Let me give you an example. I'm sure a few of you can recognize the famous Percy Pigs. I'm a Percy Pigs fan. If I was on a long car journey and there were a couple of bags of Percy Pigs in the passenger seat next to me, there would not be a couple of bags of Percy Pigs next to me when I arrived. They would all be in my tummy. I quite like Percy Pigs. Now, imagine somebody I met here for the first time today. Maybe I said to them, look, I love Percy Pigs, but is there any chance you could pop out, miss a session, pop over to M&S, and could you grab me a couple of Percy Pigs? You might say, I'm going to have mercy on this poor soul. It's been a few days. He's obviously, a bit stretched out. This would help him. I might go and do it. But you'd be less likely to do it. But imagine I texted my wife and I said, darling, I'm really in a fix. I really need my Percy Pigs. 16 long years the poor woman has suffered with me. She might say, just put him out of his misery. I'm going to go to the shop and get him the Percy Pigs. For whatever reason, the depth of relationship that she has with me creates a stronger obligation when I make the request. Okay? Now, we're trying to explain how across different cultures around the world, something is creating obligations for all peoples in all situations simultaneously. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Now, if somebody that doesn't know you doesn't have much power relationally or depth relationally with you to create a strong obligation, in order to create cross-cultural obligations, it would need to be a being of immense personal depth, of immense knowledge and substance and relational possibility. Look, I'm just going to put it out there. Doesn't it make sense that if moral values flowed from a loving personal God who is an infinite personal God with all of those capacities in abundance, it makes sense to say that this would be some of the form and shape of obligations that we would find. I think that's a fascinating thing to think about and talk about. Here's my lovely wife. I want you to notice here that I selected this photo. This is my daughter when she was a bit younger. She's now 14. But you can see my wife holding out the sweets from the sweetie jar. Can you see the look on the child's face? She is not happy about the sweeties going anywhere else. Anyway, so with God, cross-cultural moral obligations make sense. And God gives us a foundation and a framework, a grounding for moral values that doesn't dissolve them, undermine them from underneath, from their metaphysics, from the way we see the universe. Actually, it's a meaningful universe with meaningful moral principles, and that being is also capable of immense relational depth to be able to ground and supply the motivation and the impetus for those obligations. Okay, getting a bit less philosophical now. Breathe a sigh of relief. Back to our 6 reasons. Reason number 3, human imagination. So this reason is looking at how stories and myths, things that we create from our imagination, confirm and echo the gospel story. By the gospel story, I mean the story of a loving family who created a world that became fallen and broken through human choice. The promise of that God to come back and rescue that world, and then that God coming in the person of Jesus to die a tragic death on the cross, to be unrecognized and rejected by the people he came to save, and then overcoming death in the ultimate sort of comeback story of all time, to then yield and open the door to a new age of grace and relationship with God, ripping the temple curtain in two when he dies on the cross. It is finished. There's a new way of God being with his people and God's Spirit meeting human hearts. That's what I mean by the gospel. That story, I think, echoes in various ways, in various elements of it echo through our stories of heroes and our stories of just the nature of story itself. Let's take heroes first of all, and if you'll forgive me, a little digression into superheroes. Some of you might be pleased about that. It might give others of you something to talk about with the grandkids or with the kids or people around you if you're not so into it. I'm kind of a bit done with superheroes at the moment, but I do see something here that I think you'll find exciting. So maybe in our heroes, we're searching for the true hero. Maybe we're searching for the true hero. Let me give you an example you might relate to as well. Have you noticed that James Bond has changed? Now, okay, I know modern James Bond is much more psychological and emotional and all of that, and it's probably partly to do with culture now. I get that. But have you noticed also that James Bond needs to be somebody who is he's able to do the things that nobody else can do in a kind of extraordinary way where he can do these stunts and he can do these shots and he can do these moves with this coolness. He has this sort of otherworldly power to rescue and to stop something happening. That's part of what Bond brings. The other part of it is that nobody really related to the old Bond. He was too cold, too distant. The coldness that allowed him to kill and have a license to kill meant that he had no relational depth and was a lonely man. And so maybe part of the evolution of Bond has been, I have no armor, says Daniel Craig as Bond in Casino Royale. I have no armor left. Maybe there's this sense of we want our heroes to be able to believably save us, strong enough to rescue, impressive enough to rescue, but we also want them to be a bit human, that we can relate to them. Same is true in superheroes. There are superheroes who are clearly from above. Superman. He's an alien from another planet. He comes from Krypton. His name is Kal-El. His struggle is how can he be human and have relationships and relate to people. I'm just going to switch this out. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Superman and other heroes, like the empowerment that the Green Lantern receives, is a kind of, they're heroes from beyond. They're like gods from above. And their struggle often is how they can actually relate and feel and be normal. Sometimes when a superhero is empowered, they just can't relate anymore, and they can't do life in normal ways. Think of Iron Man and his struggles with his weaknesses. So you have heroes who are godlike, and I certainly believe that they can save me when I watch. I believe they can achieve it. They can do it. I mean, who doubts Superman can do it? If he can't do it, doesn't he fly backwards around the world to wind back time? So he can't fail, can he? He can't fail. His hairs on his head are as strong as iron. Do you remember that when it was in a thing holding up a weight, and then didn't somebody snip it, and then Lex Luthor did something nasty with it? Anyway. Superheroes from above, heroes from above are believable and godlike, and we believe they can rescue us. And that's part of what we love, is we love to watch heroes who can actually do it. And it's amazing. On the other hand, there are also heroes from below. Think of the nerdiness of Spider-Man. Think of the flawed inner demons of the Tony Stark Iron Man character. Hulk's wrestling with his own controlling of his temper and his rage. I think of many heroes, like Gregory House in the medical drama, who struggles deeply with pain and relationships. Sherlock, who struggles to relate as well. Think of many of these characters. Morse, struggling with alcohol, struggling with lost love, struggling with all that he has to carry in all that he's seen in all those cases. Maybe we're seeing echoes of the true hero we're looking for in both of these different sides, the hero from above and the hero from below, who are just human beings who've been bitten by a spider or wandered into the wrong physics experiment. Superheroes from above are kind of the echo of the Christology. They're echoes of Jesus being wholly God, fully God. The voice comes from heaven at Jesus' baptism, doesn't it, in Matthew chapter 3? A voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The voice of Almighty God speaking from the heavens saying, "This is the one." I mean, you would be swept up in, okay, that is powerful, that is impressive, that's amazing. You definitely would believe that he had the power to do what he was sent to do if you heard that at that point. And that's perhaps what we're searching for in some of our heroes, somebody who truly has the power to save. And on the other hand, heroes from below show us the humanness of Christ. And there's a description that I think is quite a human description in Luke chapter 2. She gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them at the inn. I've been present at 3 births. I was mainly the DJ and sort of encourager. Didn't do the main thing, obviously. But it's a messy human business. And it's an extraordinary, amazing thing to see and to experience. But actually, it's very human. Jesus experienced that. That's how human he was. Fully human, fully God. That's, I think, what we're yearning for. As we teeter between a hero that we can relate to because they're a bit more human, or a hero that's a bit stronger and a bit more powerful but isn't really human. We're searching for the whole hero. Every single human story of a hero echoes like a counterfeit for the real hero, who is Jesus Christ. And then there's the nature of story itself. When we think about imagination, we think about the way in which story functions. It doesn't matter which story you look at. There's this sort of getting to know the characters in the exposition, some sort of complication occurs, then it reaches some sort of point of climactic kind of confrontation, and then there's a resolution usually. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at the Hunger Games, whether you're looking at Twilight, whether you're looking at Divergent and the story there, whether you're looking at Harry Potter, yes, I mentioned Harry Potter, or whether you're looking at The Hobbit or Star Wars. In all of these stories, there is something going on in that characters struggle to find and overcome adversaries. There's usually a threat, an evil, the dark side, Mordor and Saruman and Sauron. There's usually some sort of external threat or internal threat that people have to act against, that they somehow hope that their heroes can save them from. It's in every story. It's in every single story. So this is why Brian Godawa, a screenwriter, says this, and a director says this: good stories narrate the events of characters who overcome obstacles to achieve some goal and who in the process are confronted often with their own personal need for change. Movie storytelling is about redemption, when we recover something we've lost or we attain something we need. Movies may be about stories, but these stories are finally, centrally, and crucially mostly about redemption. Tolkien thought that in most stories you'll find this sense of something sad and some idea of loss, and then some unlikely rescue that comes in from outside which rescues you. And he thinks those are the most satisfying types of stories, which is why you see that motif over and over again through Lord of the Rings. Here's the question: are we searching for the true story and for the true hero through what we view? Now, it might be that we're just creating because we're in Judeo-Christian culture and we're just sort of creating because that's the way our imaginations have been shaped. But maybe we're also, at the same time, doing something of a kind of remembering. G.K. Chesterton wrote in his book Orthodoxy, when he came to faith, he said this: "My haunting instinct that somehow good was not merely a tool to be used, but a relic to be guarded, like the goods from Crusoe's ship. Even that had been the wild whisper of something originally wild, for according to Christianity, we were indeed the survivors of a wreck, the crew of a golden ship that had gone down before the beginning of the world." Okay, I've done 3 of the reasons, and I'm going to speed up a tiny little bit now. So our next reason is the reason of unmet desire. Human stories, if we find inside ourselves, Lewis says this, if we find inside ourselves a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, then it might point out of this world to something else that was meant to satisfy us. That's how Lewis puts it. Even after reading the literature we thought would be the most moving and stimulated us at one point, listening to the music we thought would fulfill us, maybe getting gadgets or achieving certain things in life, marriage, car, kind of career, we still say to ourselves or whisper to each other, was this all there was? Was I not looking for something more? I have a lovely marriage. My wife is just a lovely person. We have a lovely marriage, we have a happy home, we're in good health, and we're so thankful for so much that we have. We're also close. We're 16 years in, we're just planning a date night that we might be able to go on tonight. We love each other and we're close. We talk about life together. It's a real blessing in my life. But she's given me permission to share this, but we still do find moments where we say that we desire intimacy and love and a depth of relational connection that's beyond what the romantic can provide. She's somebody who knows me better than anybody else alive, and I desire to be known more than that. And yet, if I'm honest with you, there's part of me that doesn't want to show her, even her, everything that I think and feel and do, because I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what she would think. And we all have that balance in our own hearts of we want to be loved deeply, we want to be known, we want to have that intimacy, and yet we also are ashamed and we're worried about what happens if we completely let our guard down. And yet we can recognize that there's a longing in us for intimacy, for closeness. There's a longing in us for relational depth that no friendship or romantic relationship, as wonderful and healthy as those things are, cannot ultimately provide. And this is why Lewis says this: if I find inside myself a desire that this world cannot satisfy, then the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Okay, that was quicker, wasn't it? So, cosmic fine-tuning, right and wrong, human imagination, unmet desire. Last reason, Jesus. I think Jesus is quite a good reason for Christianity, for Christian faith. And I'm meaning here Jesus' life, his works, his teaching, his resurrection, his miracles. I think all of these things point towards God. Antony Flew, who was for many years like the godfather of philosophical atheism. For about 50 years, he was the most important philosophical atheist. He said this in his book, There Is a God. No other religion enjoys anything like the combination of a charismatic figure like Jesus and a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. If you're wanting God, omnipotence, to set up a religion, it seems to me this is the one to beat. Flew had changed his mind about God, and he'd started looking at Jesus and wondering who Jesus actually was. I heard him at a conference saying that he thought that the evidence for Jesus and his resurrection was compelling and interesting. He'd been reading Tom Wright's book on the resurrection of Jesus. H.G. Wells called Jesus the most dominant figure in human history. One person in 60 or 70 billion who have lived. Nobody else quite stands out like Jesus Christ. We have no record exactly of his date of birth, yet the world's chronology is linked to his life. He never wrote a book, yet more books have been written about him than any other figure in history. And the output of those books, right now at this minute, publishers are churning out even more books about his life, his teachings, and his impact. The nearest thing that we have to his bibliography has been translated into over 2,000 different languages, and he never painted a picture. He never, as far as we know, composed any poetry or music, and yet nobody's life and teaching and impact have inspired a greater output of songs, poems, plays, films, pictures than all kinds of other art forms. One particular film based on his recorded words has been produced into more than 100 different languages. It's the most watched film in history. His book and the films about him often are doing so well on the bestseller lists that the publishers just get bored and just take them off and say all the other books apart from the Bible. Except for one brief period in his childhood, his travels were limited to an area about the size of Wales, but now his influence is worldwide. His followers constitute the largest religious grouping that the world has ever seen. He had no formal education, but thousands and thousands of university schools, hospitals, colleges, hospices have been founded in his name. His public teaching lasted just 3 years. And yet, it was restricted to one small country, and now purpose-built satellites and radio networks beam his message, sometimes with some confusion added in, and particularly the satellite channels. But now his message is beamed and shared around the world, including on the internet. That all raises a question, doesn't it? Who was he? Who on earth was he? A good place to start is actually what he said about himself. John chapter 8, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day," said Jesus. He saw it and was glad. "You're not yet 50 years old," the Jews said to him, "and you've seen Abraham?" "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered. "Before Abraham was born, I am." At this, they picked up stones. They understood what he meant. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple. Jesus is talking to some of the Jews in John's gospel record here in chapter 8. Jesus is clearly claiming to be the same God that sent Moses and that Abraham worshipped. Amazing claims. And we could turn to many, many, many other passages in the New Testament which point to Jesus making these claims. We could talk about Paul's statement in Colossians chapter 2, verse 9, where he says, "For in Christ the fullness of God lives in a human body." So this is what Jesus said about himself. And Jesus offered all kinds of information to back up these claims. He offered his teaching with such insight that initially the Pharisees were intrigued and wanted to hear him more. His works, his miracles, exercising power over natural elements, power over storms, power over physical infirmities, causing people's limbs to grow back in plain sight, causing blind eyes to see, deaf ears to hear. Jesus' character is something that attracted people. They looked at him and they said, it's a big claim, but there's a huge character and quality to this person to back this up. The people who knew him most closely were the ones who believed in him most fervently. It's usually the opposite way round, but the people who knew him the best trusted him most deeply. The fulfillments of Old Testament prophecies, some of which were out of his control, and then his predicted and actual resurrection from the dead. Tom Wright says that the fact of Jesus' crucifixion is one of the most solid historical facts that we have access to. Jesus actually being killed on the cross. Now, C.S. Lewis goes through some thinking about who was Jesus. He describes how, was Jesus, wrong in making this claim that he was God? That's one possibility. Was he aware of that? Was he unaware of that? And so he goes through different possibilities of asking, well, what is it likely that Jesus was somehow confused? Was he unwell? Was he somehow deluded? He thought he was God. He clearly wasn't, but he thought he was God. And Lewis reflects on this, and many other scholars have reflected on this and have said, Jesus teaches with such an insight and such a acumen and such an awareness of reality, of the reality of the human heart, of the reality of the social and the political and theological situations he's in. This doesn't seem like somebody who is disconnected from reality. That seems like somebody who actually knows exactly what he's doing. Even that story we just read, he knew what they were trying to do, and he slipped away from them, making the claim he wanted to claim, but actually carefully choosing the hour that he would give himself to death, that he would make the sacrifice for human beings. Well, maybe he was a bad man. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he was doing it for credibility, for status, to have lots of followers, or to have lots of wealth. Well, that doesn't really tally either, does it? He seemed to teach in a way that made it harder for people to follow him. He had few followers because he made it so difficult for them. Narrow is the way. Many followers walked off because he held to that line. He had no earthly possessions. The Son of Man has nowhere. Foxes have somewhere to go, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He didn't seem to have earthly possessions. He didn't even seem to have a place to live. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a very credible way. He doesn't seem to be a bad person. And his very insights in his teaching were to do with honesty. They were to do with actually being so honest with before God of where you are. And people found that credible. And people knew him well and were happy actually to say, I believe in you, I trust in you. That's not the kind of thing a bad person does. And so maybe he was actually telling the truth. And so Lewis comes to this conclusion. He says, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. And that's part of it. That's Jesus' identity, his claims, his miracles. But we also have his resurrection. And we know, actually, dead people tend to stay dead. Anyone who said a sad farewell to a loved one at a graveside or crematorium knows that actually that you don't tend to see that being reversed. Which is why Tim Keller says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all that he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what he said? And the issue on which everything hangs is not whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he actually rose from the dead. I'm going to show you a slide here, just very quickly. Hopefully you'll be able to look at it. There are a few facts on here that it's a description of the facts that scholars, New Testament scholars, including skeptical anti-Christian scholars, would acknowledge about Jesus' life and his existence. So fact number 1, Jesus was born around 4 BC, before the time of Herod the Great. Fact 2, he spent his childhood and his early years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. Fact 3, he was baptized by John the Baptist. Fact 4, he called disciples to him. 5, he taught in towns and villages in the countryside of Galilee, but apparently not so much in the cities. 6, he preached about the kingdom of God. 7, around the year 30, he went to Jerusalem for Passover. 8, he created a disturbance in the temple area. 9, he had a final meal with his disciples. 10, he was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically by the high priest. 11, he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, and in the aftermath, his disciples fled. 13, they claimed they had appearances of the risen Jesus after his death. 14, as a consequence, they believed that he would return to found the kingdom. 15, they formed a community to await his return and sought to win others to faith in him as God's Messiah. Tom Wright sums this up. Historical argument alone cannot force anyone to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead. But historical argument is remarkably good at clearing away the undergrowth behind which skepticisms might hide. The proposal that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead possesses absolutely unrivaled power to explain the historical data at the heart of Christianity. If it really, really happened, then the apostles' preaching is true. Christianity is real. Christ has overcome death. All who are in Christ are made alive again, and death has been destroyed. That is clue number 5, Jesus. Yes, of course I will. While you're looking at that slide, I'll tell you a little bit about the rest of my story. And so I got to a point where I began to think, through doing philosophy, that Christian faith looked credible, looked interesting, and maybe looked true. I started defending Christian belief and Christian faith to people around me, and their reactions was interesting sometimes. I thought that was another interesting part of the picture, either highly defensive or interested a little bit and then ran away. And I was interested into what it meant for me, because I hadn't yet made a personal connection to it. I'd come to believe that Christian faith was true, but I hadn't yet got to the point where I had met God. It hadn't become personal. So I knelt down in my room and I said, God, I'm kind of persuaded you're real and you're there. And I'd been thinking a lot about the moral argument. I thought, I think you're real, I think you're pure and holy. And I know I'm not. I know on any standard of goodness I fall short. And if you're holy and good, I need help and I need you to clean me up. That was my prayer. Lord, I think you're there. Clean me up. Help me. I put out my hands, and that was the day that I began to walk with God. And slowly and gradually, over the last 25 years, I've experienced a genuine friendship with God. And I wouldn't say I'm better now, but I'm more aware of where I'm not. Definitely more aware of where I'm not. But I do think that I've encountered and experienced God over my lifetime. And maybe some of you have the same story to tell, that there was a moment or moments where you felt God around you, that his presence carried you looking back through certain times. You might have been going through times and you've been saying during those times, where are you, God? But now looking back, you say, okay, I see you were with me. You didn't leave me. Many of us have experienced this profoundly in the area of feeling forgiven and shame and being set free, to know God and to have relationship with him, to come to God and to be able to open the door of our hearts to God and to have a friendship with him. And so this is the 6th clue. Ask people around you, where are the clues? Where do you see God working in your life? I'm going to now give you some recommendations, just 5 little tips. Sorry, they're a little bit off the slide there. I think we want to encourage ourselves and encourage other people to keep going in their explorations of clues. Keep going. You're nearly there. Keep going. The answers are just around the corner. And if you know what your question is, I sometimes say this to people to encourage them, if you know what your question is, then you'll know actually you're halfway to the answer, because you'll know when it's answered. Sometimes we don't know what our questions are, and finding our question and figuring out what's the the barrier? What do we need to know? That can be more of the battle. Second thing is that questions come before amazing discoveries quite often. That's often the first part, is to say, I don't know this, I'd like to, and that's the thing that often opens the door to an amazing moment of discovery. Listen carefully to the answers you get, evaluate them, weigh them up, and then ask yourself what part of this is true, and then take whatever part of it is true and act like that is oxygen. Like you absolutely cannot live without that truth. In other words, prioritize finding and living in and going to and coming under and wanting to find out and ask about the truth more than anything else. Search for the truth and live for finding the truth. Okay. I wondered if, to kick us off in our discussion together, Charlie, come and join me. I wondered if you might like to reflect on this question. What reasons connect with you? What do you like about them? Or are there questions you want to ask about the 6 reasons I've given? And we can clarify what I said and help you to understand, or maybe we can think through some objections if you'd like to as well. So, I'll give you a minute to talk to the person sitting closest to you and to share a question or an argument or a clue that you liked, and then I'll get us together to ask some questions. I'm excited to hear a little bit of what you might be responding to. Were there particular reasons or clues that you like? Maybe there are other ones that you read in your 12 clues booklet. What were your favourites, or what were things you wanted to ask about? Yeah, thank you.
I really like the human imagination one, because especially through just popular culture with superheroes and stuff like that, you can definitely see how with heroes you want them to be both human and also superhuman, and how you can see that through the life of Jesus. But the question I do have is that with the cosmic fine-tuning argument, I think you can definitely pinpoint that there's an uncreated creator, but how do we prove that that creator is God/Jesus?
Yeah, I'll start. To some extent, you don't necessarily need to. So you don't have to prove everything from one thing. So you can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead from the fine-tune argument. In that much is obvious. So I think it's okay, actually, if somebody goes, oh, okay. And I think it's a little bit of that prove that it's not contrary to reason idea. Because, oh, yeah, that makes sense, actually. And people have come up with other alternatives, like multiple universes theories and all these. They've got other different explanations. And you go, which of the possible explanations do I find most convincing? And they go, that's a really, fine-tuning because of a creator, that's a really interesting argument. I think it doesn't make me a Christian, but I think that's a good thing. Okay, now let's move on to talk about Jesus specifically, or let's move to talk about how the world was made, or something like that if you want to. I think it's okay that one argument does one job.
Thank you.
I also liked the cosmic fine-tuning because of being a scientist and having come up in the world of science. I can understand the fine-tuning, the sweet point of an experiment, and it's just so exciting to me. And I can also now, from listening to you, share that with someone who's got the same sort of brain as me. And it's made me think, oh, I know how I can get to that person now, perhaps. Get
Amazing.
the story to that person. But I also like, totally on the other side, I suppose, is the unmet desire. Because I'm somebody that will probably hide things and can't share that deep thing with even my greatest friend, my best friend, even my spouse. But you can share it with Jesus. You can be in that shower. That's where I do most of my praying. You think, how you're naked, aren't you, with your God, and that you're exposed. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. But that's where it is. That's where, and yeah, there's all that unmet desire. And again, I've got friends who I know struggle with that as well. So I think it was just sorry.
No,
I think it's a super great reflection. Can I just add to that the argument from unmet desire and cosmic fine-tuning both get you to, okay, I've got this sort of need to answer this intellectual puzzle of how there can be cosmic fine-tuning, or I've got this unmet desire, I really want it to be met. What we need, particularly with desire at that point, and with that desire to actually connect with God, if we're willing to go there, what we also need at that point is to know what God is like, what his nature, what his character is like. It's one thing. Imagine you're in a prisoner of war camp, and you're caught in the light between the fences as you're trying to escape. Behind that light is absolute threat. You're probably going to be shot in the grass. There's probably a machine gun pointing at you. It is not good to be caught in that light. The light that Christ brings is the light of his love and his grace and his mercy. John writes, the story of Jesus talking to Nicodemus, those who come into the light are willing that their deeds might be seen. Why? Because they know that just in the story of the prodigal sons, the father is running out to the boundary of the property to embrace the prodigal coming home, to try and beckon the other son to come in and not stand in judgment over God's grace. The grace and the love of God comes out further than our desire takes us to. And when we open our hearts and say, I'm willing to let you in, God, God's already there in love and in grace and in kindness, accepting us, not judging over us, not pushing our nose into the mud, but by saying, here you are, you're my dear child, you're back with me, I love you so much. And that's not based on what we've done. It's not based on some skill we have, some trick we can do. He loves you because he loves you, because he loves you, because he loves you, because that's who he is. And that's why there's a creation, because his love overflowed.
Actually, Tom, it strikes me as well that most of our desires, you pursue them to the end and they destroy you. But with Jesus, it brings life. So it's just when you're sharing that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And that's where I was. I was pursuing feeling good, feeling alive, trying to find intimacy and connection through romantic connections. I kept falling out of love. I kept finding that I had to increase the amount of marijuana I was smoking and taking. I had to party harder and longer for more days in a row, just to sort of almost numb out and block out the fact that nothing was really hitting the spot. And it was only when I met Jesus and he gave me a framework for living that was holy. And if I walked with him, then it resettled my soul, and the friendship with him became then being seen by him, being known by him. That gave me a peace in my heart which changed that basic need that I was looking for in those other desires. The desires weren't bad in themselves. Wanting to feel alive, wanting to feel connected, wanting to feel like relational connectedness. Those weren't bad things, but where I was going to find that was damaging me and damaging other people.
I felt like reason 3, the human imagination, and reason 4, the unmet desire, I felt like as I was writing down my notes that they were quite tangible and quite connected. I find it hard to tap into my own imagination. I don't know if that's because of my autism or whatever, but so I find that hard. But I do remember I used to watch superhero things, and like you said, we're all looking for that. And then, but are we looking for the true hero because we've got that unmet desire? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I want to ask a question about number 2, right and wrong, if that's okay. Because I know a lot of people who don't believe, they quite often say that if we need, this is what they say if we need a crux like Christianity or religion to know what is right and wrong, then there's something wrong with us anyway, if that makes any sense. So I suppose what I'm asking is, how do we know, where did that start, right and wrong? How, I know a lot of people who aren't Christians who are kinder than me, and other Christians I know are more patient than me, and do a lot more justice, like the food banks and all of that kind of stuff. So you get what I'm trying to ask you? Yeah.
I think so.
That's great. I'd agree with that. A lot of these almost overlap, some of these different arguments. They do kind of, it's not always quite distinct. I think the question I'd say, though, about the morality is there's a slight difference between where is there a source of right and wrong at all, and how do we know about right and wrong. So one of the questions about this is it's not just how do I as an individual know what's right and wrong, because actually I don't. I mean, my parents taught me as I was growing up, you teach your children, don't hit your sister, it's because actually at the time I thought hitting my sister was the best way of getting the toy. What's wrong with that? And they said, well, actually this isn't on, and they teach. I mean, we don't just pop up in the world with this fully formed sense of morality. Having said that, there are things within us from the youngest possible age, particularly things about fairness. Oh, that's not fair, why has my sister got that toy? Why haven't I got that toy? So there are some things in there, but I don't think it's saying, I think it's slightly different to say, how do we know about right and wrong, and how is there a right and wrong? Because I think that also connects with the fact that many different societies do have different value systems and different morality. But I think the other side of this is, I think most of us do think there is a right and wrong, even if we don't know exactly what right and wrong is. Does that make sense? So the problem is sometimes in us knowing, but most of us think there is a right and wrong. Even people who say, oh, it's live and let live, each your own way. They mean that on the things they think don't really matter. But when it really comes down to something like rape or murder or genocide or war, people do think there's right or wrong. People do think prejudice is wrong. They do think discrimination is wrong. Because they do think there is a right and wrong. And so I think I'd want to slightly separate out that, okay, how do I know? Because there might be many people who don't believe in God who live quite good moral lives. But I think this argument is there is a right and wrong. What is the potential source of that? How do you have a right and wrong without some moral lawgiver?
There's been wrong. Some people turn away from Christianity because they say, like, years and years ago, what happened in the Catholic Church and stuff, and they say, well, Christians, that we should know right and wrong and we shouldn't be doing those kind of things. So whilst that's a reason for Christianity, I've known historically that it's been a reason against, and like currently a lot of Christians can be called bigoted because of their views of LGBTQ and all of the stuff that's going on now. And so I think it's
a kind of, there can be kind of a principled agnosticism where somebody's saying, I see stuff that's wrong, I don't want anything to do with that. And we kind of go, do you know what, biblically? I can't fault that. Like, actually I'm sympathetic to that. I think the church does have some things to work out with historic abuse. I think that's right. And it does create, questions in my mind about, okay, are we really a people who care about the truth and are walking in the truth and want to bring things into the light? The principled agnosticism can then extend into, well, I want to believe in ways that have integrity. In philosophy, we call this, don't be scared by the big word, we call this kind of having integrity in our epistemology, which is, epistemology is the theory of knowledge, it's how we know what we know. So if we want to have integrity in our moral beliefs, we reject the church, and we want to also have an integrity in our in what we believe. I don't want to just believe something because everybody else believes it, or because culture says I have to believe it, or because it's a crutch. That's not a good reason to believe anything, because it's a crutch. I don't have, even if I have an emotional need, that doesn't change the truth of how the world is. Well, okay, so I'm not going to believe in it. So they have both a moral rejection of it, and they also have a principle of kind of, evidence-based thinking, evidence-based belief. I don't want to just believe something because I need that crutch. Even if I needed the crutch, it wouldn't make it true. The problem with both rejections, the problem with both of those principles is, as noble as they are, we should be people who reject what's wrong. We should be people who believe the truth for the right reasons. The problem with both is that the moral rejection of God assumes that there's a standard of right and wrong. That might reconnect by the back door to the moral argument. So instead of pointing, it might point away from the church, but it might ultimately point more strongly to God. Because where do the principles of principled agnosticism actually derive from? Especially if you're going to make cross-cultural, international moral judgments. Second problem is that knowledge itself, real belief, may itself need our mind to be functioning correctly. So if we just evolved, and the whole purpose of every cell in our body is just the successful replication of our DNA, if that's our evolutionary reason for being, then that also applies to the mind. Therefore, it's difficult to trust the mind and how it kind of offers us truth and whether or not it's pointed to truth. The other thing is that as a Christian, I can stand alongside somebody and I can say, look, yeah, you're absolutely right. You shouldn't believe something just because that something is true just because of a psychological reason. But equally, a psychological reason doesn't necessarily point to it being untrue. So many Christians feel intimidated by somebody saying, your religion is just a psychological crutch for you. It's just a psychological crutch and it's an emotional crutch. I don't need it. And it's a very well-known objection that people make. The problem with it is that even if we took the disciples, those early witnesses to the rising of Jesus, right? Even if we took the disciples who saw Jesus, met Jesus after the resurrection, they saw his life. Even if we said that all of those people, given all that they'd seen, even if we said, look, they just were looking for a projection of a father figure, the Freudian archetype or the Feuerbachian archetype. They were sort of looking for a father figure, they were projecting from their psychology, they were essentially sort of looking for something which would fill this emotional religious need in them, this impulse. That's why they thought it was true. How does any of that change the fact of whether or not the tomb was actually found empty? How does that change the historical fact of whether or not Jesus actually died on the cross? It doesn't change it one iota. It changes the trustworthiness of the disciples, sure. But actually, that event of his death and his resurrection stands somewhat independent from their testimony. And so even if we say we go the distance and we say, yeah, you know, some people do believe because of a crutch, it could still be true. What do you think? Do you think it's really true or not? And that we bring the challenge back to them and say, yeah, and it might meet an emotional need. Something that's true does meet emotional needs. It should be what we expect as well. So, thank you.
I'm conscious that it's lunchtime.
Yay.
But I just want to, and maybe you can't answer this now, but I'm resisting what you said about, and you didn't actually quite specifically say this, but the idea that here is truth and here is church, and we might reject this, but it might bring us closer to God. I am really scared by that because I think we're in an existential crisis, and I think the fluidity of the world we live in, identity and morality, which seems to me to be working its way into a very chaotic situation, and what is then the unifying principle, and that really worries me, because if we are going to say, well, me and my individual nature, I will find God, but I'm going to reject this, where's the unifying principle that is going to allow people some solidity and some surety, if I'm now going to fit into a sort of cultural anarchy of a fluid individualism? Sorry, does that make sense?
Yes, it's a brilliant.
It's a very good question. Charlie's actually written a whole talk on it.
Well, actually, let's leave that. The last session is faith good for the world? And one of the things we're coming to is, what about when the church gets it wrong? How do you reject church? How do you accept God? How do you accept church? So, if we don't answer it again later, please ask it again. But let's let everyone have lunch.
Could I very briefly say, I don't think any of us would defend every single thing that occurs under the banner of Christendom, historically. I don't think any one of us would defend everything. But that doesn't mean, in making the distinction between something being true and saying something like that, it doesn't mean that we're saying throw everything out. In fact, supportive, loving Christian communities were a very important part of me working out my faith, getting taught doctrine, getting taught truth. Okay?
Great.
there was like elephant property, but Jeremiah said it once, didn't he? He said how sheep are wandering around without a shepherd. And I just feel like there's probably many Christians in the world today like that.
Yeah. I think we do need clarity about God. Thank you for your questions, which have helped us get that.
Are we stopping now? I
Yeah,
think, yeah.